Good evening, everybody, and welcome to This Woman's Words Presents Women Who Write. So I know that there are some new faces and some familiar faces on this screen. I'm going to start with the one that you've probably seen on this screen with me the most, which is the amazing Toni Autry, who will be our moderator this evening. As many of you know from the advertisements, this event is being held to celebrate the National Day on Writing. And the National Day on Writing is an initiative of the National Council of Teachers of English, and it's built on the premise that writing is critical to literacy, but needs greater attention and celebration. And so that is what we're here to do. We're here to talk about writing, to celebrate writing, and to also view writing from our different cultural lenses. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to the one, the only Toni Riddle Autry.
Thank you very much. So I am so pleased to have these ladies here. My first question that I have is, when did you start writing? Were you immediately drawn to writing as a form of expression?
So I think the best thing for us to do is probably to introduce ourselves as we answer. So just introduce myself. I'm Shereá Burnett, AKA This Woman's Words, a native of Alamance County, North Carolina. I'm something like a social worker most of the time. And in my spare time, I'm an adjunct professor at a local college. So when did I start writing? I started writing in elementary school. And I was immediately drawn initially to poetry. And the reason was because I had the death of a grandparent right as I was starting kindergarten, and writing kind of helped me process through that. I liked poems because I could easily make things rhyme. And there was also a certain, I would say, cloak as to poems, because you could go as deep as you wanted to or stay as shallow as you wanted to just get the words on the page. And I'm going to pass it to Dee.
Hey y'all, I'm Dee, pronouns they, them, and I am a doctoral student studying policy at American University. I'm also an adjunct instructor at American University, teaching undergraduate students and teaching in the School of Education for the Masters of Arts in Teaching. I'm also an educator, specifically in ELA by training and by trade, so that's where my heart is. And the main reason why I wanted to even teach ELA and why I got invested in ELA was because I love to write. I also love to read. So I love not only writing myself, but also reading other people's writing. Given the communities that I grew up in, and just given all of the trauma that I've experienced, I'm going straight in. A big part of how I was able to escape and also reimagine the world was by experiencing other people's worlds through books. So then that led me to, short stories, but then it would be in the form of like a diary. So some people could say, I guess, like Diary of a Wimpy Kid style. So then, when my parents found said diary, then it was like, what are you talking about here? But it's like, they're just short stories. But you think that I'm talking about, whatever is in the stories. So I've definitely felt really connected to writing because it's been a form of healing. It's been a form of escape sometimes. And it's also been a tool for me to reimagine the world and think about what is possible outside of just like the material world, but also like the spiritual realm and how we can actually tap into who we are, what we need, what we see, what we don't see, and how we can bring that into life. Because if you can visualize it, then you can actualize it. Should I kick it off to Amina?
Yeah, anyone, Dominique or Amina, whoever wants to go first.
Sure, I can go ahead and go. I want to make sure my connection is okay. So is it good?
Amina, you are breaking up just a little bit.
Okay, I'm giving it a second. Okay, I think we're good. So I'm Amina Ghaffar. I'm a Lumbee and Black woman from Pembroke, North Carolina. And currently I'm working as a sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking advocate for the Commission of Indian Affairs, and my views do not reflect my employer. I'm also
I think Amina's having a little bit of technical difficulty. Dominique, do you want to pick it up and then we'll switch back over to Amina?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Miko, my name's Dominique Daye Hunter, aka D-Day. I am Black and Saponi. My family's from Oxford, North Carolina. And I am a storyteller. I own D-Day Hunter Designs and Eloquent Expressions Writing Services. And I started writing, I always say when I was 12, 13, but now Shereá has me thinking back when I was younger, I was already like writing poems and being really proud, like extra proud to bring them home and read them to like my parents. But when I was 12 and 13, I was able to use those skills, if you will, of storytelling to cope with the traumas in my life and in my household, experiencing domestic violence and depression, even at a young age. And I was drawn to definitely, like I said, poetry. By the time I was 13 years old, I had probably like hundreds of poems written on like my old AOL account back when AOL was a thing. Yeah, so needless to say, none of those survived like the new millennia or whatever. But yeah, I mean, writing has always just been, ever since then, has been my go-to whenever it comes to expressing myself or just needing to cope or understand whether it's like a social interaction or just events that happen. It helps me to process not only my thoughts, but also process like other people's actions, if that makes any sense. And in that way, it's really allowed me to heal and given me a safe space to not feel gaslit and to just experience my world through my lens. And so I have, I'm forever grateful to writing for that. And that's how I began my writing journey.
And Amina, we want to come back to you.
Okay, I think I'm a little bit more stable now, no pun intended. But I think I was also drawn, I'll just go ahead and jump into the writing part. Credentials and stuff are not super important to me. But I started writing similarly to everyone else when I was little. I remember I actually just recently had found some little picture poems that I had drew my mom in elementary school. And I was like, these are pretty good, like I was spitting like back in when I was like 5, so that was just cathartic, because at one point in time, like I kind of felt ashamed or really shy about sharing my writing. And so it got to a point where I kind of had to a lot of inner healing took place before I was able to share more about my thoughts and inside of my world. And then I also view writing as a tool through the lens as a scientist. I do have a background in biology and integrative medicine. So I had to study scientific writing in college to learn that specific style of writing. And I also use that in a tangent with Indigenous centric forms of writing to be an activist, which will probably lead us into our next questions.
So it does seem that all of you have bars, which we appreciate. A lot of you talked about the deep emotional connection and getting your words out. I have definitely had my fair share of writing an email and writing it exactly how I feel in that moment and then taking the emotion out before I hit send. How did you get to a place where you felt okay sharing your words with others? Because they are deep personal thoughts. And I'll start with you, Shereá.
She act like I put this panel together or something. So This Woman's Words is a platform where I write. And I'm going to tell you, Toni, I don't know that you're ever fully there, right? I think there are some pieces that it's nothing to put that out there and to let people read it. It's others where you gotta think and meditate and pray on that thing, because the questions, the responses, it's like that, the videos going around on TikTok where somebody says something smart to you, you say something smart back, and then the group chat explodes and you just ignoring all the notifications. So sometimes you post stuff and then you go to sleep because you don't even know how this is about to be received. So similar to Amina and Dominique, I am also Afro-Indigenous. And the most recent time that I still felt that like uneasiness was writing a piece called Birthright last year for Indigenous Peoples Day. And it was about my journey towards getting my tribal card and what that felt like for me personally. And I was worried about embarrassing people. I was worried about bringing up stuff that some relatives didn't want to talk about. I was worried about what some people in the tribe who knew me or didn't know me might say in response to it. And then I was at a certain level resigned to the fact that this is my story. And I created this website to tell my story. And maybe somebody else needs to read this story. Like maybe somebody else is going through it or could potentially go through it. And I want you to know you're not alone. So at that point, I felt like the piece was written and it was bigger than me. So I posted it. I didn't get a lot of pushback. What I did get was people reaching out to me, apologizing because they were present and thought that they had been supportive. And then after reading it from my perspective, realized that what I experienced, they didn't even understand it at an emotional level. They thought just bringing me to the table was sufficient. They didn't understand that having to defend who you are does something to you. And so, you know, I had one friend reach out to me and tell me that the blog post brought her to tears. And that wasn't what I was prepared for at all. But I also felt like we then had a very necessary conversation about the differences that sometimes exist in our communities and how we have to be mindful of those, that we can't just bring you to the table and leave you at the table. If I brought you, I too need to support you. So I think it still comes, especially the pieces that are the most telling about you or about something you experienced. I think that's when you have the real nerves, because it's like you're putting yourself out there and you don't really know how it will be received. And at some point you just decide to grin and bear it. And some people post it and then take it down. It really just depends on the feedback I think some people get and the additional trauma it could add to you just from sharing that.
Anybody else?
I could speak to that for sure. So when I first really began to share my poetry, I was about 22, 23 years old, and I had some friends that were encouraging me to enter into a competition. It was actually like a native talent show competition at Arizona State University. So they were like, yeah, you should do spoken word. So it was my first spoken word piece I'd ever performed, and it went well. And that kind of started opening me up to sharing my story, at least part of it. So back in 2015, now that's only 6 years ago, and we still know what's palatable and what's not to some folk. But back then, being Afro-Indigenous was not palatable at all, at least where I was and who I was surrounded by. So people are it was just very new information or new ideas to them, or there was that energy of pushback, if that makes sense. It's not always words, but it's that like question of like, oh wait, where did you say you were from again? Or, again, like re-questioning your identity and having to defend yourself. And as someone who, has been reconnecting since my teenage years to my Indigenous roots, and having grown up like in the tri-state area, it was a battle. Like it was a battle, and especially being out here out west, because it's just different than back east. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. But basically, I too have experienced that pushback. But now, my up and coming project is all about Black Indigenous resilience, and it's unapologetic. And sometimes I think like, oh man, is this only to specific audience or whatever? But you know what, it is, and that's who it needs to be too. And so I feel like that's a big part of like the whole evolution of me sharing my story. And it can be really traumatic. Like it can open up old wounds, either for you or for other people. So yeah, sometimes you have the strength and the spine to to keep to keep it up, and sometimes you just are like, all right, you know what, I'm gonna archive this for another time, because for me, again, storytelling is all about healing and that journey. And it's not always going to be easy, but it definitely should not be, I'm not trying to make it harder on myself. So
because then you have to write about
that.
feel from sharing your experience in the first place.
It's a cycle. I'm trying to break the cycle. Exactly.
I'm gonna go to another question here. Why are women who write important to societies and cultures? I'm gonna start with Aminah.
I'm glad you picked me for this one, because so I've recently learned of this concept of epistemicide in the past couple of years, and it is basically the killing of other cultures' way of knowing and knowledge and writing. So anytime anybody picks up the pen that is not white, that is not European, that is not writing in a Western way, you are an activist. You are using writing as an active tool, especially if you're actively integrating or naturally like allowing your ancestors or like whatever to channel through you, or and you can kind of see that in the things that you're interested in. So like whatever your passion is, you have to use writing in a sense in some way, shape, or form, whether you're in medicine, whether you're in law, whether you're in creative writing. We use it in all those spans, but it's so important not to just, because I was just watching something about segregation on Netflix last night. It happened in Durham, North Carolina, but we spent so much time trying to get integrated in these white schools. And I was thinking to myself, I was like, wow, was that really for the best? Because we did like move away from the safe spaces that we had, like learning within our own cultural environments, not having to feel like we had to adhere to this colonial system. So, I struggle with that, but at the same time, it's like, obviously those institutions had more resources. They had more access to more types of books across the world or across different, is it really that diverse? Because, when I was in high school, we learned the same 5 authors, like the Shakespeare's, all of the run-of-the-mill white authors. And then when they tried to include stuff, it would be stuff like Uncle Tom's Cabin, where they're talking about it from a perspective of the good slave, or like the slave that obeyed his master. So, there's like a lot of like subtle things in our education system that contribute to this sense of epistemicide, or this lack of acknowledgement of other ways of knowing. And I love having people like on this panel, like the people who will probably talking about influenced us, talking about how they challenge that system. So that's why it's so important for women and for people of different cultural backgrounds to write, to use it as a means to challenge that epistemicide.
So I know you said that anytime you put a pen to paper, how important is it for people to journal?
Very, very, very important. And I think I've actually been slacking on it lately myself, because there is still like an energetic drainage sometimes when you do have to write. But when you finally get to the point where you're past that and you can like put words to a page and like form thoughts and be able to process things in that way. And I think a lot of us from, whatever background, a lot of us are kinesthetic. And so, it helps us to process things that, because when you're just swirling around in your head, like there's no type of, you're not forming any type of linear, I guess, cascade to it. I don't know if that made sense, but journaling is very important. And it's something that I try to do daily, if not weekly.
Diana, I saw you nodding your head. Can you add to that?
Yeah, so I have to be very transparent. I'm one of the people who has definitely been slacking on writing. Also a person who's at a stage where it's like, yeah, no, I'm not at a place where I feel comfortable putting my work out into the world and sharing it. very much going inward. So for me, it's like, I know the importance, I understand it. My therapist, make sure that I'm making it happen. Do I always do that? Not necessarily, because a big part of writing for me is very vulnerable. When you put something on paper or when you put something out into the world, for me, it just feels so final. So then it's like, okay, so yes, I said this in 2013, which is a situation that I'm really in. That it's like, I was 19 or something along those lines. And it's like, obviously 28-year-old me, or at least I would hope 28-year-old me is not holding that same politic. So I'm a lot more sensitive about what I'm putting out into the world and what I'm choosing to share. But then even with journaling, it's like, wow, looking back at something I said 2 days ago, that it's like, wow, I was really in a place that is concerning. Maybe I need to go do more of this, or running from myself and all of the things that are happening around me. Because then if you actually take the time to sit and in essence have a conversation with yourself, then you get to really see what is happening around you. And it forces this workaholic who has internalized whiteness and achievement as a way of coping with life and running away, to really face where I am and why it is that I continue to just go and go and go and go, versus actually sitting with the fact that, ouch, this hurt. This person did this that felt really dehumanizing, but I'm going to continue to produce, because even though they treated me, horribly, I'm going to keep doing the thing. So yeah, it's like, it's important for us to really get our thoughts and our feelings out, to make sure that we are having those conversations with ourselves, that we are processing, we are reflecting, and ultimately feeling more grounded. But sometimes that's hard when you spend a lot of time feeling but running away from that. So yeah, it's a hard place to be.
Do you have any advice for any women who are beginning to write or beginning to share their writing? I'm gonna pass this off to Dominique.
Ooh, first of all, thank you, Diana. I needed that. I'm gonna sit with that tonight, especially the internalized whiteness and overdoing things and overworking. I just have to say thank you for sharing that. I needed that word today. So, and I'm sure I'm probably not alone. Okay, so back to the question. If you're so any advice, so my advice to anyone who is interested in writing, is a little hesitant, if you're in a safe space, do it. Just write. Like, there is no, as we're decolonizing, as I'm decolonizing, I'm trying to also learn there is no good or bad. Like there is it's like what you do with it, So, and just being more supportive, be supportive of yourself, be kind to yourself. Like, if you write something, it's important because you're important, you're not here by accident. That's at least how I believe. And my process and learning in life is like, you're not here by mistake. And so all these words, all these thoughts, all of these ideas in your head, like they're significant in some way or another. And even if they are disturbing to you, that tells you something too, right? It's all a part of like that journey. So definitely write. Just start where you're at. It's okay also not to write. Like it's okay. Like, even like me, like I'll go through months sometimes where I'm not really inspired to write, and I try not to be like, am I even a writer still? But everyone goes through that, but whether it's writer's block or you just have a lot of stuff going on. Maybe you're processing the story, maybe you're living the story right then and there, so that's another tip I would give too, is like, if you're starting to write, practice the art of self-awareness and observation, because the smallest details can help you, whether you're doing it for personal writing and you can look back and remember things and recall things and kind of tie things together for your own self, or whether you're even like creating like a story or a poem based on your lived experience, or something of that nature. So that would be my advice.
Anyone else?
I would say that I think we have to also remove the idea that everything you write has to be shared. So I think historically, especially in communities of color, women have carried a lot of the history, a lot of the trauma, and a lot of the stories. And one thing that I think that we have to be mindful of in communities often is who we share our stories to, who we give our stories to, and what we're giving them the opportunity to do when we provide our story to them. So I sometimes think that we have to be mindful of when something might not need to be shared, or when it needs to be shared with specific people, and maybe only those specific people. I think especially for those people on this screen, a lot of us do public writing, public speaking, things of that nature, but there are also things that we have to keep to ourselves, not because they're secrets or because they're hidden or anything like that. It's more like because they're sacred. And you don't want everybody else's hands on things that are sacred.
Yes, we are in a world of oversharing, as we see as some people share their statuses sometimes. So I'm glad you said that. Say it louder for the people in the back. One thing you also said, I know that we talked about whiteness, and I have conversations with people that say professionalism is another extension of racism. I know this is probably going to open up a can of worms, and I want to hear from every single one of you on this one. How do you feel like professionalism has affected you, and how has it made you, in a sense, maybe fit? And if you don't feel that professionalism has been kind of adjusted to whiteness, that's fine. You can explain that as well. But how has that affected you, and how does that make you? Do you write about those things as well? I'll start with you, Shereá, since you're already there.
Here she goes. Y'all see that? So I think for me, it's kind of like, earlier you made a comment about the impassioned email that you then feel like you have to change. So that's probably where I see the most professionalism connected to writing. And what's frequently troubling to me about that is how we decide who is the aggressor and who then necessarily is the victim, or vice versa. We decide who the victim is, so then you must necessarily be an aggressor. And I think that especially when it comes to written words, a lot of times we hear about people being angry or mean or your tone. And I still will die on the hill that you can't tell my tone through an email. And if you can tell my tone through an email and you don't like my tone, then maybe the issue isn't my tone, but what you did to get that tone from me. I think that professionalism has impacted for very long, like what was considered acceptable, like acceptable poetry. Spoken word wasn't always appreciated as an art, right? And I think that things like that have led the expression, like the idea of freedom of expression, to be very important, because maybe that's how you emote, maybe that's how you share, and you shouldn't have to tailor that for a certain audience if that's not who your target audience.
Amina, what are your thoughts?
Well, the first thing my mind went to with professionalism is how we're told we need to dress. And like I've had passive aggressive comments made to me, and I'm someone that's applying to medical school. So I've had people tell me that you shouldn't wear long earrings to a medical school interview. And I'm like, long earring life, this is anti-Indigenous, like you can't tell a Native woman not to wear her long earrings. And and that's my personal stylistic preference, but it was like little things like that. And I didn't really catch on when it was said to me at first. And it's one of those things where it kind of like, it hits you later. And just like noticing kind of like the passiveness of it, or that person may have not even like realized that that it would bother you, or that it was anti-Native. And I think that's kind of like another conversation is implicit bias in general, and just being able to identify it, especially when it relates to Indigenous people in particular, because it's often not shared from that perspective. When we're having these drive-by workshops about implicit bias, and we need to be having sessions every month about implicit bias in our workspaces and in any professional space, because doing a drive-by workshop and checking it off of a box is not enough. And we can see that because we're still having a lot of issues in every single one of our systems. So, but that's my 2 cents on professionalism.
I'll go to you, Dominique.
Woo, this one's a big one. All right, my perspective. So being a full-time artist and a full-time writer, that's what I do for a living. I guess the biases that I experienced before, I have more freedom now, but of course they're still there. You know, everything from like what Aminah was talking about, you know, like your physical appearance or what you choose to wear, and even what Shereá mentioned, you know, I have a specific target audience, you know, and so whereas like if I get invited to like a children's museum, like I'm not gonna be cussing up in there, but you know, just words I've heard from other people like, oh well, yeah, I know that, you know, I don't like to cuss, or I don't like to speak a certain way because it's not professional, from someone who owned their own business, you know, but I know like, you know, that's your thing or whatever. So I'm like, okay, I don't know how to take that, but it is me. So, you know, so again, I think that just having to make your stand and just to know that you're telling us, at least for me, I'm telling a specific viewpoint for a specific reason too. And for me, it's like, how are we going to know how to heal ourselves if we don't want to look into the dark parts of ourselves? How are we going to know how we want to go forward or grow when we don't want to look back at the past and the ugliness and the truth, you know? But yeah, and that's also something I've experienced literally this week. You know, I sat down and I said, okay, like I was struggling with it for a long time, and I was like, I need more work boundaries. I need more work boundaries, like, you know, just for my time and my just how things are structured and everything. And it was something I really had to go deep inside and say, why am I so resistant to have boundaries? You know, like this is, I'm in control, you know, like I could do this, you know. And I really do think that again, it's as a Black woman, as an Indigenous woman, as women of color, like we're taught, you know, that if we say something that's just straight fact, then again, it's like we have an attitude or a tone, or we're being aggressive, where if a white man were to write the same policies, it'd be like, oh, okay, that's law, you know, which is not even law, it's a policy. But anyway, yeah, so that's something I've experienced. It's like, it was uncomfortable. But again, you know, wow, it's just hitting me. But I guess writing helped me heal, you know, with that in an unexpected way, because as I mentioned, usually I use it for poetry, but man, writing down those policies and writing down my hours, like that was healing, you know, that was empowering. So yeah, and I definitely think that it was hard to push send, but I was like, I have to do it. I had to do it. So, and I'm glad that I did now. So that's my take on my little perspective on professionalism.
Diana, what about you?
Yeah, so it's complicated, mostly because as a person who values writing and is a writer, I also am holding that tension of like, whiteness also values the written word over any other kind of word. So it's like very much, if there's no written contract, then it isn't real. You can get away with anything because it wasn't written down in the handbook. Or it's not actually stated in my contract that I would have all these additional duties. So you can tell me to do whatever it is that you want because I'm already here. So it's a weird, complicated tension. And for me, it's forced me to remove a lot more of, I guess, to be more concise, it has forced me to be more concise. So all of the emotion that I could possibly put in my email, my, you know, notes from a meeting, I have in essence been forced to remove that, but also thinking about how whiteness tells us to remove emotion, and also patriarchy tells us to remove emotion and to value logic. So then it's just like, well, this is what happened. At 9:58 p.m., you said this in this meeting, so let's bring it back to the notes. So then it's like, in a lot of ways, internalizing whiteness in ways that have forced me to remove the emotion, the humanity of what it is that I would want to say or want to do or who I am, but then also using that as a tool in a lot of ways to then protect myself against that dehumanization of like, this is what you said, this is what you did. But it's, yeah, there's a very big tension there for me, especially having been working for the government and what that meant, because I'm a person who thrives with writing. So even my partner who's watching, hey babe, that's like, if we're having some conflict, I have to ask for some time so I can text you, because I'm very much a passionate person. Like, I'm going 0 to 1,000 in tone and volume, but it isn't that I'm angry at you, but I'm angry at the situation. I'm feeling very passionate. I'm sad, and it sounds very, very angry. And I'm aware of that because I'm an Aries, okay? I'm aggressive. So sometimes I just need to put it in writing so I can remove that at least remove the tone. So all you can get is my message, because I have a chance to just kind of put it all out there. But then that being read as documentation. And that being like a nasty word in government of like, well, you're just keeping a paper trail on me or on this situation, when all you're doing is sending an email with the notes from the meeting that the whole team agreed you would be taking. But no, you can't send it in an email, because now it's in writing, which means it can be documented or tracked by the owners of the server and it's just like, it's a very weird tension that has then pushed me to do to then be more verbal at the same time. It doesn't really make sense, because whiteness also doesn't make sense as a construct and as a way of being and existing. So it's like, you want things in writing because that's what makes sense to you, but then at the same time, we're also being told that that is something that you shouldn't be doing, which could be connected to identity, and that we need to talk. But then if you're talking, then that means you can get away with whatever it is that you're doing that is dehumanizing or against contractual obligations. So it's a whiteness has made things a lot more complicated. And it also, when necessary, whiteness will do what whiteness needs to do to protect itself, and then throw everybody else under the bus, while also forcing you to then become what it is that whiteness wants you to be. But then telling you, not for you though. For us, as the people who have institutional power, it's okay for us, but for you, you can't do that. You can't do that.
You touched on something that I relate to as well. I can be very, very, I am a Leo, like Shereá, and I can be very cutthroat with my words if I am in that passionate state. So when I say I need a minute, I want that minute to gather my thoughts and gather myself. And sometimes I have to write it down so I can see how it sounds. And sometimes I'll come off a lot nicer via message than I would when I actually say it. So I definitely understand that.
So Toni,
yeah, go ahead.
I got to jump in on that though, because Leo. But second of all, I'm glad Dee said that they was an Aries, because I was gonna bring it up later, but brought it up. But I was also gonna say how, like, when we look at this culturally, so you want me to remove my passion, my emotion, the things that make me me. You want me to remove that so that what I say to you is palatable, but then I still cannot use my words to hold you accountable, which kind of leads into some of the other questions for this evening. For example, why women are, why it's important for women to write in our societies, right? Like why we have to hold on to that. And I would say that what immediately came to my mind when Dee was talking was the work that Ida B. Wells did around the anti-lynching movement, and how, people were threatening her life because she had the gall and the audacity not only to speak truth to power, but to write it down with pictures and documentation. Not because you felt like you were wrong for lynching somebody for false claims of rape or whatever else, but because she had the audacity to document it, to show you and to show your involvement. And now it's the how dare you hold me accountable? How dare you, you know what I mean? And I think that is why historically women have been very fearless with writing, fearless with our words and our speaking. And I think it's because a lot of men and a lot of cultures have given us no choice but to be, because we've had to hold our own people accountable, and we've had to hold people oppressing us accountable. And I think too often that is why women of color in particular are targeted with these random stereotypes and foolishness, is because if you degrade and undermine me on the front end, then whatever I say, you think it holds no power on the back end, because I've already told you they're just angry. It's not that I'm wrong, it's that they're just angry.
So do you think, and this goes for everyone, do you think that maybe people kind of frown, or people that, not us, but you think people don't want women to write because they don't want us to hold them accountable?
1000%, yes, absolutely. And I think this goes back to this to the question about why is it important for women to tell stories and to write. And for me, and it also ties in my favorite writer. So my grandmother, she was a writer. She was also a survivor of being a Black woman in Alabama growing up in the 30s, and she saw lynchings and a lot of evil things. And you know, people tried to silence her voice because of what she had seen, and I think after a while she herself just wanted to stuff that down, and did that through, you know, alcoholism. And I really do feel like I'm here to continue on her work and her story, and to share not only the things that she experienced, but also that I experienced, and anyone who's being undermined or taken advantage of, like sharing those stories. And even from personal experience dealing with, you know, assault and abuse, you know, they don't want those stories out. They do not. They absolutely do not. And I have experienced firsthand bias, like going to events and being a performer, and at different events, and it's like the first few performers are all usually women, and they're usually or, you know, gender fluid, and there's a very thin crowd, and then all of a sudden, you know, toward the end of the show or the second half of the show, it's a lot of men that show up, and you're usually either doing music or something else, and everyone floods in, and everyone's listening, and everyone's at attention. So I said, all right, then I'll do poetry and hip hop, so y'all can't ignore me. So most definitely, they do not want these stories to be told. And that's why it is so important for women to pass on stories and to pass on the truth, because in the current, I think it's called Girlhood is Complicated, the Smithsonian exhibit, there's a whole quote about, and I don't remember exactly, but it's a whole quote about how American Indian girls specifically were targeted because US Anglo educators knew that they were the ones that were to pass on these stories and their cultures and their histories. And you know, I definitely see that. So it's definitely, you know, the mothers and the aunties and the sisters and the relatives that just have that nurturing spirit. They're the ones who are perpetuating, you know, our culture and our stories. And that's why it's so important for women to write, in my opinion.
Go ahead, Shereá.
So Dominique knew I was coming right. Because I also feel like, because Dominique she be up here with me. I also feel like they don't want us to write because we give other people permission to do the same, to tell the truth, to hold people accountable, right? And I say that thinking about how people ridicule Toni Morrison for the types of stories she told. But I have yet to meet a person of color, specifically Black people, who could not identify with at least one of Toni Morrison's books, right? So I think about the books that they removed from the Bible and how several of those books were specifically about women, and that the decision makers of the day, presumably white men, determined that these books conveyed messages to the female readership that they were not comfortable with them having. And I think that it was when a a female minister made the comment to me, it was like they didn't want to empower them by even giving them the idea that they could be treated this way or demand this or do that. That was when I understood, like, even down to, I was raised in the church, even down to the church, how these messages are conveyed about women and their words. You're supposed to be seen and not heard. Why is it important that you not be heard? In like specifically that part. So the words have always been an issue. And I think, you know, Dominique talked about carrying on the legacy and the history, and there are certain gifts that we all receive from our ancestors. But one of the first things that they did in residential boarding schools, specifically in America and Canada, was take away your language. Why? Because if you can't tell it to your people, you can't go home and tell your parents in a language that they understand the treatment that you are getting, then it didn't happen.
Love that. So I'm going to ask one more question, and it's going to kind of be a two-part question. Amina, I'm going to start with you. What does your activism look like as far as your writing? And then how can viewers learn more about you and your writing?
It's a loaded question. And loaded because I've kind of, I'm sparse across a lot of different places, but I'll start with missing and murdered Indigenous people. And just going back to how difficult it was to initially share my writing. The first march that I did in Annapolis, Maryland, I was overwhelmed with anxiety, and I was actually one of the last speakers in the cohort, and I was the only Indigenous speaker in that cohort, and this was back in 2017. So just again, like highlighting how Indigenous women are often kicked to the back of the POW. But I almost didn't get a chance to speak, and then I was able to speak. So being able to, even if it's just as simple as being able to say someone's name, and because I think we get so washed down in the politics or that have surfaced around the missing and murdered Indigenous people movement and the commodification of it and the aesthetification of it. I think we forget that this is really about the families, making sure that their relatives are remembered, making sure that they're taken care of when the hype has died down about their relative being discovered as murdered. So that's a huge part of my writing as my activism, and making sure that their voices are also elevated and that they're supported when they have events and things like that. The second part of it is a little bit more nerdy, going back to the epistemicide thing. So when I was in graduate school, I studied integrated medicine, and in learning about the different medical systems around the world, one of the things that bothered me and that I noticed was that a lot of the people that came in to talk to us about these Indigenous modalities were white. And I didn't really know how to put that into words when I was in school, but as time went on, I discovered things like biopiracy, which is the theft of Indigenous knowledge, and the misappropriation of the benefits of that knowledge to Indigenous populations. And so being able to name things like that and to put that in writing for people and to help them understand how that's also connected to the environmental movement and how our resources are being over-extracted, the knowledge from our people are being over-extracted, our people are being killed for having this knowledge on top of all of this, our people are being killed for protecting the environment and providing research that shows that these corporations and things of that nature are damaging the environment, and because it's all about capitalism at the same time. So really, really short summary of just a few things, but you can read more about biopiracy and missing or Indigenous people at my website, goodmedicinewoman.com. And the reason I called it Good Medicine Woman is because I think it's important to make sure that we are practicing good medicine, and that the ways that we are learning about medicine are ethical, and the making sure that the populations who have passed this knowledge down for generations, making sure that they're credited for having that knowledge, and also have the appropriate amount of payment for that knowledge. And of course, like there's this argument of Indigenous people in some areas don't have a concept of wealth, but at the same time, they shouldn't be exploited. So learning how to navigate like that line as well. But that's my website, and thank you.
All right, Dominique, I'm gonna go to you next.
Ooh. I always just love listening. Sometimes I forget. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm here. So definitely my activism and writing centers around violence against women, people like women, children, elders, and two-spirit people. Specifically like domestic violence and lateral violence, colorism, and pretty much things that I myself experience. And I see that it's a pattern, and it's a pattern of colonialism, and it's not just me experiencing it, it's the world that's experiencing it for the most part. And so a lot of times things that I'm writing down, that's part of my activism, but also sometimes just getting on an Instagram story and just going off about something is also part of my activism. Like, listen, y'all, like if you already extra stressed today, save this for later, but this is what I have to say, and I think just holding that sacred, like really safe space for people to be able to be themselves and to be able to express themselves. And that's why I do what I do, because I want the world and life to be better, not just for the next generation, but for this generation as we grow through it, and also all the generations coming forward. And my poetry can be found at ddayhunter.com. And then also, like I said, if you want to see me go off about something, you can find me on Instagram at ddayhunter too. Or obviously Facebook too, Dominique Daye Hunter.
And Dee, if you'll go next, please.
Yeah, so my activism looks like a lot of different things, especially connected to writing. So as I shared, I'm a doctoral student, so I am actually in the dissertation writing stage, May 2022, okay? So close. We're speaking it. It's happening in May, okay? We're not extending this process. But anyway, a part of my activism also looks like making sure that I'm bringing and making scholarship something that is more accessible to everyone who would then have access to it, that it is also honoring the lived experiences of the folks who I'm saying this is meant to serve, and not coming in as a neo-colonizer telling folks what they should be doing or what they should be experiencing just based on my own privilege as somebody who isn't experiencing the world in the ways that they are. It also looks like actually mustering up, the courage when I am feeling like I can, to share my work, to share my voice, to share pieces of what's happening in my mind, sharing some tidbits around how folks can support their students, how folks can show up in a way that is more intentional, that is more purposeful, that is more humanizing to the folks they work with and work for. It looks like supporting other educators and making sure that they're learning how to create liberatory spaces for students to be able to not just verbally or vocally share what it is that they're feeling, they're thinking, they're experiencing, and how they envision the world, but also making sure that students feel comfortable putting that down on paper, and that they are comfortable enough seeing themselves on paper in the way that they will. It also looks like teaching and making sure that students, again, are comfortable writing, that they feel safe writing, that they're sharing their stories. So regardless of whether I'm teaching, sixth graders, or if I'm teaching my master's students, I'm starting every single class with a reflective prompt so that they can actually tap in with themselves and get grounded and think about what they're experiencing, and building community, using their vulnerability as a way to build space and to create a liberatory space with one another, and having writing be what anchors all of that. Activism looks like showing up as a non-binary Black Latinx person in the world, showing up fully. It also looks like, just being here every day. Like there are a lot of folks who can't even say that, right? So, and that's a heavy thing in itself. And folks can definitely tap in with me by following my Instagram and / Twitter. It's the same handle, mix_, so MX like a mixing bowl. But anyway, mix_Tejada, Tejada. So mix_Tejada. And yeah, that's where I share a bit about education, what it means to create liberatory spaces for students, regardless of their age, and how we can then use writing, ELA, and our general pedagogy to make sure that we're working toward a world that is freer and giving folks the space and the tools to be able to reimagine what is possible.
Fantastic. And Shereá, if you will close us out as you share your information as well.
So first, I'm going to ask Diana to spell her handle for me because I want everybody in the comments.
MX_TEJADA.
I wanted to make sure that I spelled it right because I don't need them Aries problems. Okay. So I feel like my activism is how I show up in spaces and the words that I use when I interact with people in different spaces. I do a lot around scholarships for people who may not come from the best socioeconomic background. And as we know, most of those people gonna look like the faces on the screen. And so I always try to speak life into them and let them know that they can do this. With or without this scholarship, you can do this. Like you are built for this and it is okay. Because I sometimes think that we underestimate the power of the things that we say to people and what that inspires and triggers in them. As far as in writing, my activism looks a little different. So if you go over to thiswomanswords.co, I like to call people out, not by name or anything like that, but I like to talk about things that maybe we don't want to talk about. So there's some pieces up on the site, like one is America is Burning, that is really like a discussion about the differences that were made between Breonna Taylor's murder and George Floyd and why that difference exists. There's a piece called Farming While Black, which talks about racism historically in the farming industry and how it's still prevalent now. And there's a piece that is called Disrespected, Unprotected, and Neglected. And it's taken from the Malcolm X quote. So Malcolm X once said that the Black woman is the most disrespected, unprotected, and neglected person in the world. There's another one called Being a Black Woman Feels Illegal, because sometimes it does. And so I just talk about things based on my own experiences, but also some of the implicit biases that we're not always aware of when we're interacting with people and what that looks like. And so for me, right now, what activism looks like is educating people. I'm doing a lot of work around literacy with the understanding that literacy is freedom. And a lot of people that I have found as adults who are not very good readers or not strong writers and who struggle with literacy tend to be women. And that tends to put them in a position of vulnerability with partners. And so doing some work around that. I also recently started a page within my website called These Women's Words, where people can submit their writing and we essentially celebrate women who write. And I help share their words and get their words out there, as well as sharing their websites to kind of drive people towards them. And I did that not only to share it with others so that they would see their writing, but to empower those women who are writing, to let them know that what they have to say is important, whether they have a website or not. What you have to say and what you want to share is important and valuable. Hosting events such as this has been a form of activism for me in the pandemic. I already wasn't a fan of being in spaces with only a handful of people. So you can only imagine that I wouldn't want to do this in front of thousands or hundreds. That's not really the mission, but I can bring it to you on Facebook and 400 people can watch this later and that'll be just fine. Okay. No germs, no COVID, didn't have to wear a mask. Y'all got to see my lipstick, it works, right? Much like Amina, I too like longer and big jewelry. So the mask and my earrings, it's a battle, it's a problem. So this works for me, okay? I would say that another thing, of course, that Toni and I are working on is the Unlearned documentary, which is about racism in Alamance County, where we're from. And there are writing components to that as well, because we've had to do interviews and submit statements and things like that. So still a form of activism, because Toni is an activist, whether she realized it or not. I think I just, so now she's aware. Wonderful. All right. So with all of that being said, I want to thank everybody on this screen, from Dee to Dominique to Amina to Toni. This was such a wonderful opportunity, such a great and necessary conversation. For all of you watching, make sure to check the comments to get Twitter, Instagram, and website information for those people on the screen. And make sure you support the work that is being done, not only by these people, but by those people in your life, particularly women, marginalized, or those who are frequently silenced. I think we can all agree that if nothing else, we must give thanks to the ancestors, the higher powers, and the divine for women who write. Y'all have a good night.